really excited to welcome you to our session on workplace and professional effective altruism groups. According to the 2019 EA survey, almost 50% of self-identified community members work in the private sector. 35% of them are planning or doing earning to give. And at the same time, we can see that there's a robust evidence on the risk of value drift. This led to the hypothesis that there is currently an underserved segment in the EA community, and strengthening workplace and professional groups might, as well as offering services to high-impact professionals, might be viable countermeasures. Our session today will consist of 3 parts. First, we're going to have a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A. You are invited to submit your questions with the swap card app. I think everybody is familiar with that in the meantime. And after that, the live stream part is going to end, and we are going to divide the audience into 4 groups where you can approach the panelists directly and talk about certain questions. And also, we encourage you to get some one-on-one connections. And now I'm really excited to introduce the panelists to you. Devon is the co-founder of High Impact Professionals, a charity entrepreneurship incubated organization that aims to enable working professionals to have the biggest positive impact possible. Previously, he worked at Founders Pledge as the CTO and Managing Director of Germany. Joan is the Managing Director of the Center for Effective Altruism, and she's in charge of EA groups and started to look with Jona and myself into workplace and professional groups. Jona Glade is the founder of the Effective Altruism Consulting Network. He works as a consultant for the Boston Consulting Group and CEA, where he looks into workplace and professional groups. And Meg Tong has a background in natural science and computer science. She worked as a quantitative strategist at Morgan Stanley and will be joining the EA crypto hedge fund, Lantern Ventures, as a trader. She runs the EA Finance Group. Thank you so much for joining this panel. I'm really looking forward to an interesting discussion and also to the questions from the audience. Well, to start, Meg, what is it you actually do at the Finance Network? Maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so I mean, the ultimate thing that we're doing at the Finance Network is trying to have as much impact as possible. And so I guess the terminal goals of that are really to increase the amount of donations that our members are having, and also to make sure that people are moving into high impact careers, which may or may not be inside finance. So all of the goals are really structured, and the activities are really structured around trying to achieve those terminal goals. Instrumentally, that also means strengthening the community, making sure that people have close connections with the community, and also expanding the community, so making sure that more people who are interested in finance and also interested in EA actually find out that the EA Finance Group exists. So to recap, terminal goals, donations, and high impact careers are really important to us, and the activities that we do really support that.
That sounds great. Jona, how is the Effective Altruism Consulting Network different, if at all?
Yeah, I think 2 main things. Obviously, we have a lot of similarities, but I think we're structure-wise, we are set up a little bit differently. So we are really organized around workplace groups. So at a consulting network, every workplace, for example, McKinsey or BCG, has one workplace group with one EA node who runs the workplace group. And we have this Effective Altruism Consulting Network as an umbrella organization where we coordinate between the different groups and see what's working in which company, and we learn from each other. And we also use like economies of scale. So if one company, for example, prepares something, we can quite often use, in our case, quite often slides and apply them to the other company as well. So I think it's maybe one key difference. I think you are more decentral.
Yes, well, I think it's largely one group, most people invited to most events. I think the main aim is to get everyone talking to each other and everyone actually getting good information from each other and getting support for their donations and careers, but in kind of one more centralized.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think the second difference is also our theory of change. So obviously for you it's a lot about money, and in our case it can also be about money. But I think for us the much bigger lever is actually the careers and influencing the careers of consultants, as most of us only stay in consulting for 2 to 3 years and then really try to transition. and then having them transition to EA orgs is also, I think, a much higher priority for us than maybe for the EA and Finance Network.
That sounds so interesting. Devon, I think you took a slightly different angle by founding High Impact Professionals. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's definitely some overlap. We definitely plan to support and expand the workplace and professional groups, and we plan to do things a bit differently as well. So we envision not only supporting community building with these groups, but to be the so-called switchboard operator between the, as you said, 50% of EAs who are in the private sector and EA organizations who could very much benefit from the skills that the private sector has that EA organizations might be missing. So our vision is that someone in the private sector, let's say someone from the consulting network says, I want to engage more, I want to do something with my skills, maybe I'm a strategic consultant, what can I do? And we can say, aha, you'd be great, well suited to go to this organization and maybe give a workshop or mentor somebody there and provide this cross-pollination of these two different groups.
That's very interesting. And Joan, what is your perspective on the workplace and professional groups landscape, and what do you think, how can they have the most impact?
Yeah, I'm really excited to see the emergence of more workplace and professional groups. Stepping back within the Center for Effective Altruism, one kind of thing that we think about in terms of our theory of change is sharing EA principles when individuals are around university, maybe even younger, to have them encounter ideas at the time when they're shaping their worldview. And then knowing that folks are going to have peak career impact in their 50s or 60s, it's really important to retain individuals. And so I think city groups that form forms of professional networks and workplace and industry groups are going to be really, really key pillars for that. I definitely think we're in the early stage of figuring out the playbook and what this can look like as the community grows. I'm excited to see a bunch of innovative models on the stage today.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of connects to my next question, because Meg, I'd like to ask you what you think workplace and professional groups can do to retain highly engaged EAs, because I think it might be one of the key aspects of your work.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really glad that Jane mentioned it, actually. So I think avoiding value drift and promoting retention is something that's really important for workplace groups, especially if you're working around people who are maybe non-EAs and have very different values to you. So I think having a close-knit community of people who are friends, who can come to meetups and see the same faces again and again and actually form really close connections is very important to promote retention. I think another thing is which is actually really useful about having these close-knit connections, that you can get useful information from people. So talking about how you're donating, because I think I mentioned to you earlier the donations that can be very individual things. So having a community with which you can actually talk about the things that you're doing on an individual basis can be really useful. Or getting career advice from people who are connected to you very well and actually understand your situation can be really, really valuable, and something that you get from having this very close-knit community.
Maybe expanding on your thoughts on the impact, we did a lot of interviews with different workplace and professional groups, and what we saw that they are very structured differently, right? So there's quite often it's a Facebook group where they communicate ideas, then it's more advanced structures like with the EA and Finance Network, and obviously also the ways to impact may vary a lot between the workplace groups. So for example, here's the quite clear case of donations and careers, but then also, for example, the UK civil service or public service group might have other levels, for example, influencing their organizations or policies. And one way we are thinking currently about it is it's probably there's some core every workplace and professional group could be doing. So providing career advice, helping EAs who are thinking about joining this career, giving them insights, helping them enter if it's the best career decision for them, or just having this healthy community. And then there are some optional parts which may vary between groups, right? So this is, for example, donations. Super important for you. For public service people, maybe not as relevant. They're the influencing the organization is much more important. And I think also figuring out this theory of change for each group is super relevant and a very important next step to develop the space further.
Yeah, you and I have talked about what might be the unique comparative advantage of each group, depending on what the EA ecosystem needs as a whole, and then what that workplace or industry can offer. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and that being said, like you mentioned, Jona, not only are there differences, but we saw in these interviews that there were a lot of similarities between groups, and there were a lot of gaps between groups because most are volunteer run, so they haven't done everything yet. This pathway from students to joining the professional groups looked like a missing gap, and doing general outreach. There's a lot of things that can be done that seem like they're cross-applicable across all groups.
And do you think there's anything we can learn from successful university or local groups?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is really interesting is a question of how to preserve high fidelity ideas within effective altruism. And so I think there have been interesting ways of thinking about engagement that don't require people to recreate the wheel. So can we have an 80,000 hours podcast that everybody listens to and then comes together to discuss? Or what are ways that reading groups could take off? And so I think that might be one option, is thinking about how you take busy students, engage them with high fidelity content, and what workplace groups does that work in? Maybe what workplace groups does it need to be adapted to? I think a second thing is thinking about what's the way that folks that are excited can have leadership opportunities, because I think when you have volunteer leadership opportunities, that can really promote engagement. So in our university chapters or city chapters, sometimes that's being a facilitator, but in workplace groups that might look different. It might look like advocacy or serving as a career mentor or running a donation-based event. And so I think there's some interesting question around what's the scalable way that you create leadership or engagement opportunities for folks within workplace groups that we could look at university groups and city groups for.
Joan, I really like what you said about students being really busy. I think this is actually something that's super relevant for careers.
Yeah.
People often don't have time to really fully engage in the same way, and I think providing opportunities where people can do things really easily and efficiently is really important. So if people want to act altruistically, providing means for them to do it in an easy way that actually makes sense to them and doesn't really interfere with a lot of the rest of their life in a significant way is super important. So I love what you said about that.
And maybe building on that, even also having their collaborations with other EA organizations might be super helpful as well, because quite often just having some outside view is relevant. So for example, in the consulting network, we have one consultant who aligns with the CEO of an EA org bi-weekly and has just a 1 hour call with her, and then they just spare on ideas. And that's just a way where you can, as a consultant, get involved with the EA community, also network, but also you can offer something relevant to the EA community by just having this outside perspective, having seen different organizations, how they are run. So there are many different options, which we need to explore further.
Yeah, and I'd add on there that since time is such a premium with people in these workplace groups, because they're very intense industries, that makes money all the more better and a way to keep engaged. So donations is something that people can do, since money is something they have a lot of compared to time, to maintain their engagement over time and stay engaged with EA. Yeah.
And thinking even more about time resources here, what do you think, when should individuals prioritize putting an effort into workplace and professional groups? What could be risks here? What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think often understanding what your theory of change is really important. So keeping that in mind, how is the thing that you're doing actually resulting in the end goal, which is having more impact? So is the thing you're doing actually increasing donations? Is it making people make bigger donations? Is it making people make better donations? Is it actually helping people make better career decisions? And really trading that off against what the other things you might otherwise be doing. Are you going to be scaling up your own career? Maybe you want to actually put more effort into making sure that your own career is actually more impactful. So doing those kind of trade-offs and making sure you actually understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve is really important.
And do you think, speaking about the EA community in general, are there any risks or uncertainties why we shouldn't prioritize this as all from an EA perspective?
Yeah, I think there are several risks involved. First of all, what we see also in the consulting network, that people tend to stay longer in consulting just because they like hanging out with the EAs and like-minded people. So that can be a good thing in some cases, but it can also be a bad thing. So maybe it hinders people to transition earlier to an EA org they would normally. So I think that's one thing. Also another thing, what is imaginable, that also EA-aligned students might enter consulting earlier or just enter it instead of having a more direct career path, just because there's a group who's hopefully friendly and helps them to enter the space. So I think they're having a very balanced career advice, and also giving the counter arguments is super important to not have too many EAs joining us. It can make sense in some circumstances, but I think in most cases it doesn't make sense, for example, to join consulting. I think that's one key risk. Then also then they the typical risk, when you're communicating about EA, especially at the workplace where people don't have a lot of time to engage with the ideas, that there are some misconceptions about it. So these are just some ideas which come to mind. And I think there's also lots of uncertainties, like we already discussed, right? We are not really sure yet which activities are most valuable, and what the actual impact will be. So I think just exploring that and doing a lot of hypothesis testing and trying a lot of things and learning from university groups, learning from city groups, and then just finding the model which works best for us and every group is also like one key next step.
I also think we're still in the process of figuring out how to measure retention. And so I think there's some folks in like kind of outside view, like this idea that like, you know, if you're in a community of folks that have pretty different values than you, it's really helpful to be around folks that are value aligned. I think that makes sense. But then there have also been some people who have done some analyses that are like, well, if you're really engaged in university, maybe we see, you know, lack of retention for folks that were less engaged, but for folks that were super engaged, they like stay over time. So I think on balance, there's a question, at least in meta organizations, which is how much effort should we put into growth and outreach at university versus how much effort on the margin should we put into things like retention. And that doesn't mean that both aren't important, but there's still an outstanding question around allocation. And so if an individual is in a position where they specifically are thinking about, you know, outreach efforts versus retention, or should that happen at students, or should it happen with folks that are more mid-career, I think there are still like marginal questions there that we're figuring out, which doesn't mean that compared to doing nothing, they're not good. But for people that are choosing between different options, I think we're still getting some data about which ones are more important to do on the margin.
And looking at the workplace groups in, for example, different consulting firms, I think, Jona, you were involved, or you were part of the process when different consulting firms installed workplace groups. What do you think went well? What were success factors there?
Yeah, I think some similarities between see for like successful workplace groups, especially like when starting them. So I realized like folks who really focus like on output and just being practical and just getting it started is super important. So in the beginning, like many people think about, with whom do I have to align in my company to found this? And it's more often just quite practical to just start like having a WhatsApp group or a Slack channel and just adding people, like looking up on LinkedIn in the 80K group, who of my company works is an EA and is in the 80K group, and just adding them and then going from there instead of having too much thoughts about like which structure, what is my target structure and where are we going. And what we realized also is that it's a lot about the people. So I think it's good to have your theory of change and like your target picture on the back of your head, but then like also being a little bit opportunistic and just seeing like who comes up, and also like grabbing the good people who are super engaged and seeing what's interesting for them and helping them to grow, and then nudge them more and more towards EA courses, and your target picture is something very relevant. Yeah, and I think overall also just doing a lot of hypothesis testing is super important. Like if something is not working, like as people are working full time at least, I wouldn't push too hard on it to not get disappointed, but like also like see what's emerging. And quite often, especially like what I noticed in the consulting network, it's a lot about being at the right place at the right time to identify, for example, company donations and influencing them. And that's something which is very unforeseen. And it doesn't make sense like to push very hard on your CSR team, so corporate social responsibility team, to really change it if they are not interested in it. I would just leave it, but it can be indeed very impactful. So we have, for example, one member who just recently influenced like 2 million of donations of this company, where just like there was no one who would care about it, and there was like no way we could have foreseen that. In other companies it wouldn't work simply.
Yeah, I want to jump onto that a bit. One thing we want to do at High Impact Professionals is to inspire people to affect change now. I think often in EA there's this sentiment that I just left university, now I'm joining the workplace, I'm going to build career capital, and then in some future nirvana state I'm going to have all this crazy impact, and kind of along the way everything else is instrumental. And I think there's a lot of things that people can do now that they're not doing. And Jona is actually a great example. So at BCG, Jona had the idea, I can make a slide deck about effective giving, blast it out to BCG, and it resulted in $150,000 in effective donations going out. And it was just like, he had the idea to do that, he did it. Like you said, you don't need you can start a WhatsApp group or something. You don't need this massive theory of change. Of course, you want to think things through, but I think the barriers are a lot lower than people think in general to just having impact, and you can do that now. Yeah.
That's great. So are there any other next steps that come into your mind you would advise the audience to do if they want to get involved with workplace and professional groups?
Yeah, I can go for it. So I imagine the audience, we probably have 3 target groups in here, right? So one is like people working at non-EA orgs, So I would really encourage them to reach out to their like workplace groups, or maybe even founding one if there isn't one. And if it's the most impactful thing you can do, you might have other opportunities, other projects which are more impactful. Then the second group is probably like students. So I think all of the workplace and professional groups are super keen on giving advice and like helping out with career decisions. So I would really encourage to just reach out to us and also see if there are any groups around. And then the other group is probably effective altruism organizations who might be interested in corporations and see some synergies there. So I would also just really encourage you to reach out to us, and then we can see like what the different needs are and how we can help in the most effective way and hopefully create some synergies.
Yeah, and I would say feel free to come talk to me. There are a lot of groups out there that, like I mentioned before, aren't super transparent because they don't have the capacity to build a website or something like that. So you might not even know that a group exists. So if you're interested in finding out what groups are out there, just feel free to come chat to me and I'll help you out.
Great, that sounds very motivating. Is there anything we left out that you'd like to share with the audience from your perspective? Great, and I'm gonna have a look into the Q&A section. Okay, we have a question for Jona. How does the process of presenting EA concepts to other consultants look like? Do the firms allow time for building company groups? Is it happening simply by sending slide decks towards colleagues? I think we partly answered that already, but maybe you can go deeper into that. Or is it mostly happening during personal conversations with interested colleagues? Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, we are still exploring, so I don't have like the golden like thing you can do and it will always work. What I noticed, it's a lot about personal context, also like in the EA Consulting Network, like the people who are most engaged also at BCG are just like also somehow friends or people I worked with and who know me personally. So I think like these personal contexts are super relevant, and for example in the beginning I just like, before founding the consulting network, I was just giving a talk about EA at the workplace in my office, just to see like how people would react and test the hypothesis. Is it actually relevant for consultants? And I got very good feedback there. And from there it really went on basically, because then like they would know me as the donation guy, and then like cases would reach out to me, and yeah, you would build your brand also within your company and also accelerate your career with it actually with EA thinking, because you have knowledge others don't have. So this is one answer. And in the beginning I gave a lot of talks. I organized them in the beginning on myself, but then I realized it's much easier to reach also a counterfactual audience by using existing formats, and also just much less work. So like having like checking out what formats are there, like if there's social impact meetings, if we can talk there. And then I also decided to go just offline and just blast out a donation guide, and I think that was probably the most impactful thing I did, because of two things. First of all, the donations we collected, but then also based on the feedback we got from the people, right? So there were people messaging us, oh, that's great, it's so logical, how can I help? We identified volunteers, we identified EAs we didn't know before existed at BCG, and that was super helpful for us to accelerate the group. So these are some ideas we are trying, but then I think it also depends on the workplace and your culture, and also like your position, where you start. And I would like always recommend to do a hypothesis testing, do something easy in the beginning, you're working full time, and then just see where it takes you and what's working. Yeah.
Great.
And I think there's also other groups which can help people out. For example, I'm really happy that High Impact for Professionals is going to exist. Mm-hmm. And I know groups like One for the World are really interested in giving more workplace talks, and have a whole slide deck set up, and have given really successful talks at places like Microsoft. So I'm really excited about having kind of also external help. So you're not actually creating all this stuff yourself. You can use stuff that Jona's made, which is pretty great, or you can use things that Devon is going to make. You can use stuff that, I don't know, people at One for the World have already made. So it's very exciting.
That's great. The next question is, it seems like there's some really positive professionalization of various EA groups. High Impact Professionals has $100,000. Jona is working part-time for CEA. CEA is funding offices and staff on some uni campuses. How do you feel these efforts will add significant counterfactual value over what people might achieve as volunteers?
Good question. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think all except for now the EA Consulting Network, they're all run by volunteers, and they tend to be in industries that are very time constrained. So the people just don't have the capacity to put in the effort that's required to make sure these things are successful, and that professionals don't value drift off. And so we envision keeping people engaged in their EA journey so that maybe they one day go on to work at an EA organization. And I think there's a pretty plausible theory of change here that this is a mechanism whereby people will join the EA organizations where they otherwise wouldn't have.
And within CA, one thing that we haven't mentioned here is also the funding that we have for city groups. So if you have a person, having an individual in person through our community building grants program, where they can create an in-person professional network. And these are different than workplace groups because of, as opposed to be like EA and consultants, where you're across a consultant anywhere in the world, these would be EAs in New York. And the EA finance group is like a sub-community of the EA London community as one example, but also has some global members as well. Meg, feel free to correct me.
Oh no, I think that sounds approximately correct.
Yeah, and so I think that another step in professionalization that we've seen is being able to have physical meetings for professionals across different industries in one geographic location, in addition to connecting professionals within a given industry or in a given workplace. And I think being able to have someone full-time to help be a nodal person and figure out who are all the other professions in my professionals in my geographic area can help strengthen some of those connections that are really valuable to folks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. What are some suggestions on how to find members for your groups? While unis have Freshers Fair and central places to advertise, we as a city group have found it difficult to find members.
Members within the workplace or within
for your groups? So I guess like for I understand the question is that how can you find new members for the EACN and for the EA?
Maybe I can do the workplace and do the city groups.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So for the workplace groups, how we always get started, we look like in LinkedIn groups, EA org. So for example, ATK has a huge LinkedIn group, but then also I think there's the General Effective Altruism LinkedIn group, and then we just type in the company name and just write everyone who's in this group, and it's very likely that they are at least EA aligned and interested. And from there, we take it, and I always recommend also in the EACN as the second step is sending out this donation guide, because then you will just identify much more EAs, which you won't find via LinkedIn. And then, you see where it goes from there, and hopefully you also have a website or a Facebook group, and a mechanism where people can sign up, where people can find you, and then they reach out to you. So I think these are the three main avenues for us.
I've also had a lot of success with personal connections, just asking people to tell their friends
Absolutely.
about things, and that's actually been probably the most successful way of getting people who are actually engaged and interested.
And on a community infrastructure level, as CEA puts more effort into university groups, we're really interested in this transition from university to workplace. I think when you start your first job or move to a new city, that's another really kind of critical place where you might be thinking about who are my friends, what are my peer networks, what kind of values are going to be around me. And so things that we're thinking about in this space are what could handoff look like from university groups to city groups. As we have a more in-depth list of workplace groups, we can think about how to add that on. Thinking about when individuals sign up for virtual programs and your exit survey, you can say, please connect me to my local in-person group. When you log into the EA forum, there's now a list of geographical groups that you can see, and we're hoping to build in a geographical feature where you can say, oh, I'm in this location, so you know the group around you. So really thinking about how to strengthen those connections between different parts of our program, so individuals don't feel like they're alone.
Great. What other professions or fields do you think there should be an EA group for next, aside from finance and consulting?
Do you want to talk about, there are several others right now. Do you want to talk about some of the ones that do exist or highlight some of those?
Yeah, sure. So I think several which come to mind, and please jump in if you have no more, in the public sector, there's the UK Civil Service Group, then in Germany we also have a public sector group. Then in the private sector, we have the finance network, the consulting network.
Medicine
as well.
And there's even subgroups under these groups, so
yes.
This has been a real exploration. There's EAs in medicine in the UK, EAs in medicine in the German-speaking world, and if you just go deeper and deeper, there are these groups that are out there and you just don't know they exist. Yeah. There's even an EA jet propulsion lab group, which was mind-blowing to me that it could be that specific, but yeah.
And coming back to the question, are there any fields where there aren't any groups yet, but you think it would totally make sense to have some?
I think this is worth exploring. So I think there could be not workplace groups per se, but different stratifications. So like maybe earning to givers who are giving certain amounts might want to interact with each other. Even cause areas, I think, are groups that don't exist but could exist and draw meaningful engagement. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. I think maybe adding on that, what I would be personally super excited to see is journalism. I think there are some, and I think there's just like great synergies and great learnings you can exchange between each other, what's working and what's not working and what your priorities should be being. And it's also just a very motivational factor. I think the second one is really like public sector probably in different countries. I mean, the UK Civil Service Group is really doing a great job in influencing the public sector and policies there. And I think that's potentially a high impact path. And then maybe also for research or for some research fields, aligning the people better there could be also very impactful.
And you can kind of think of this as like what's the top-down and bottom-up model. Mm-hmm. So the top-down might be something like, look at Ben Todd's talk, look at the state of EA, look at on the margin some of the skills where organizations or other or funders are saying they feel like they're particularly talent constrained in their field, and that might give you a top-down on the margin what's most important for us to build up professional networks in. So maybe something like journalism or communicating EA ideas might be one example of a field, but then you also want to be opportunistic and bottom-up and think about who are the people that are like well-positioned, have a good understanding of EA ideas and are poised to lead that network. And so I think there's kind of a matching situation that needs to go on in order to answer that.
And I mean, there are also like many groups in the tech space. So I think Facebook, Microsoft have very strong groups. So I think maybe even having there like an umbrella organization, like the AACN for consulting and maybe an umbrella organization for tech firms could also be something which could be impactful. Like just for saying from the outside, obviously you would need to explore when you know the space better than I do. But it's just another idea which could be relevant.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to prioritize here. How and how much do you talk about effective giving at work? I have heard of Giving What We Can members putting in their email signatures, etc. But I avoid talking about it as I don't know how to without causing negative reactions. Seem like you are bragging. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, so for me, I always I don't talk directly about EA. I see what the person is interested in, and then I see if I can find a hook somewhere. So now about donations. So if someone is really interested in finance or investing, then I just drop in a sentence, you could also think about the return of investment for your donation. And then I just simply see how the person is reacting. And then if he's super open for it, I will go further. But I'm very conservative personally, with doing pushing too hard for EA courses or even just mentioning EA. So even though if the person is interested, quite often I will just mention EA in the third discussion and just see where the person stands, what's the specific question which is relevant for them, and then just meet him where he or she is and talk about the topics there and provide some EA content, and then maybe I might broaden the scope. I think I personally could be more proactive about it because also quite a lot of people are grateful for having this information. But that's just not my style.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think there's a lot of work to be done, like I said before, of encouraging people to push a little bit more. I think there's really low risk in talking about effective giving. I agree effective altruism is maybe a bit heavy-handed, but just saying hey, some charities are way better than others, look at this evidence, can't feel too risky to me. And like Jona said, kind of feeling it out and seeing how it goes and taking the people who want to go on the journey further feels pretty robustly good to me and something we should be doing more of.
Great. Thanks a lot. Before we move on to the next part of the session, I would like to thank the virtual audience for attending. And this is going to be the end of the live stream, so please join me thanking Devon, Joan, Jona, and Meg for this interesting discussion.